Tom Pelissero, everybody.
Hey,
Tommy P.
Hey.
What's up, Rich? What's up to the fellas in studio?
What's up, brother?
Tommy P.
What's up, Tom? NFL Network insider. All right, Tom, I'm just going to give it to you straight. Like, there's no sugarcoating it. Is one of the winningest coaches of all time and the greatest coach of our generation and maybe the generation before it and maybe the generation after this one going to be left without a job? Is Bill Belichick not going to be a head coach this fall?
Barring a surprise, right now, there is not a spot for Bill Belichick in the NFL in 2024. He was a serious candidate with the Falcons. He had the initial meeting with Arthur Blank. Then he went into the facility, went through the same car wash they were doing with all the other candidates, meeting with everybody throughout the football operation. My understanding is Belichick and Blank were continuing to talk. Bill was taking this very seriously, that he was going to be prepared and have the plan if he went to Atlanta. Somewhere along the way in recent days here, as they did the additional second interviews and continued to discuss internally, they decided to go with somebody in Raheem Morris, who for a variety of different reasons is very different from Bill Belichick. Chief among them, with Raheem, he has been in the building. He's been a member of the Falcons coaching staff. He was the interim coach several years ago before they decided to go out and hire Arthur Smith instead. With Belichick, there was going to be significant changes to the entirety of how that building operated. And that's not to say that he was going to go in there with a hedge trimmer and saw off all these different people and they're all got to be out of the building. It was more so Bill Belichick knows what, in his mind, a championship culture looks like. He knows how to put a program in place. What the Falcons and other teams were evaluating with Bill Belichick is, are we going to make all these types of changes, redo how everything in our building has operated from a football standpoint for a long, long time for a 72-year-old coach who, yes, Rich, he is quite possibly the greatest we've ever seen, certainly the guy who's got more rings than anybody else. The Falcons ultimately came to the conclusion they were going to go with somebody who was younger, who had a different outlook, and who was going to keep a lot of the existing infrastructure in place. Time will tell on whether or not the Falcons made the right decision. But if you look around the rest of the NFL, everyone at this point, Rich, barring a surprise, has rendered the same decision, which is no matter how many games Bill Belichick has won, he's not going to be our head coach in 2024.
Wow. So was it the power structure within the building? Everyone's been talking about Rich McKay, the CEO of the Falcons, and how the setup there was something that might prove unworkable. What's your reporting there and where it currently stands with Morris now in the building?
I would say the Rich McKay angle of this has been vastly overblown. Rich McKay was never, somebody who was a hard line. It's either Rich or it's Bill. Rich isn't going anywhere. I mean, he's very closely tied in with Arthur Blank and the broader businesses that Arthur Blank runs. And Rich McKay is one of the respected individuals in the NFL. He's the chair of the competition committee. Football side, business side, everything. Everybody holds Rich McKay in high regard. This was more so about what is the building going to look like moving forward. They are changing the structure. The head coach and general manager now are reporting directly to Arthur Blank, not to Rich McKay. So to the extent that there was this idea, well, Rich McKay is the reason Bill Belichick can't take this job, wasn't really reflected in that from the Falcons end or for Belichick's end. Bill Belichick was very much, again, ready to make things work in Atlanta. There were going to be organizational adjustments. There's no question, because Bill Belichick, going all the way back to the early 90s when he was the head coach in Cleveland, has always had contractually that he is the head of personnel, that he is effectively the general manager. Terry Fontenot could have stayed. Rich McKay could have stayed. There would have just been a different function to how that building ran. And when it boiled right down to it, and they were having those internal discussions, they came to the conclusion that they were not going to go that direction. And so right now, Bill Belichick is a head coach without a home, and quite possibly, Rich, as much as people may want to have a funeral right now for Bill Belichick's coaching career, everything that I have understood to this point is taking a year off and coming back in 2025 to continue pursuing those records and try to get this thing going someplace else is very much still potentially in the cards for Belichick.
Tom Pelissero right here on the Rich Eisen Show. And so there's two gigs still open, Washington and Seattle. Fair to say that they're targets are coaching this weekend? That's why these jobs are still open? What do you think?
Not necessarily. I would say with Washington, they've got a bunch of interviews set up next week with the guys who are still in the playoffs. You're seeing Anthony Weaver on Monday night. The Lions are making their guys available in Detroit Tuesday and Wednesday. So somewhere in there, the Commanders are scheduled to meet with Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn. And then Dan Quinn also has an interview. I think that one's going to be on Tuesday. So they had a second interview with Bobby Slowick. They, still need to do one more interview to comply with the Rooney Rule. So right now they could not make a hire even if they wanted to. So I do anticipate the Commanders are going to get into next week. With the Seahawks, they've been going through their second interviews this week. They had Patrick Graham. They had Mike Kafka. They had Dan Quinn. Today they were supposed to be having Raheem Morris, who became unavailable. Adrio Avero is the last one that's currently scheduled. That second interview is going to happen tomorrow. With John Schneider, he's waited 14 years to be able to run this process. And so from everything I've been told, it seems like Schneider and the people in Seattle are enjoying getting to know different people and getting to hear different philosophies and understand how different things work in other buildings. I mean, Pete Carroll hired John Schneider back in 2010. I know kind of Pete overblew things a little bit there, basically talking about, Johnny, you've been waiting 14 years for this opportunity. I mean, he's had Schneider in a closet somewhere this entire time. He's been very much involved in the personnel operation and done a lot of things in the draft and otherwise. But this is, that opportunity to really try to get this thing right. I know there's been a lot of speculation about Dan Quinn, the natural connections to John and to Pete. I've never gotten the sense that this was all means to an end and they're just checking boxes and then they're going to hire Dan Quinn. He could be Seattle's next head coach, but the other guys that they're meeting with here are all real candidates too. And that interview process potentially, if they're going to see Ben Johnson again, could go into next week.
Then where does the 2021 Coach of the Year fit in here, man? I mean, where does Vrabel fit in? Could he be on the sidelines too?
Unless the Commanders go back kind of on where they've been headed throughout the course of their process, Mike Vrabel also may well be a coach without a team for 2024. I know that there's been a lot of local media speculation because I was asked about it on Seattle radio a couple of days ago about Mike Vrabel. Never say never, Rich, in any of this. If you had, strapped me down and said, is Dave Canalis going to be a head coach in the NFL a few weeks ago, I would have said, no, I don't think so. I mean, everybody thinks highly of Dave Canalis in terms of the energy. He did a great job this year, especially down the stretch with Baker Mayfield on that offense. But that's a name that when he got the offensive coordinator job in Tampa a year ago, it was a surprise to a lot of people within the league. Good for Dave that he's getting that opportunity in Carolina. You never say never, but I don't really anticipate the Seahawks search going the Mike Vrabel direction. And this is something we talked about on the Insiders today on NFL Plus and NFL Network, where when you look through the names that have been hired this year and like what's the running theme? Obviously, it's a more diverse list than we've had in prior years, but it's also a list of guys who bring a lot of positive energy to the room. When you think about what Raheem Morris is, you think about Dave Canalis's reputation. Gerard Mayo is basically a motivational speaker. Antonio Pierce, there's certainly more edge. He's a Raider, but it's still like an uplifting, bring the locker room together type of a guy. Jim Harbaugh is the outlier in this entire list. Brian Callahan's the one I didn't mention, going to Tennessee, another really positive reinforcement environment. That's what he comes from in Cincinnati. Jim Harbaugh got a text from a coach yesterday saying, the Chargers players have no idea what they're in for. And I said, well, what do you mean? And the response was, he is literally a robot sent from outer space to coach football. Harbaugh's in a different category. He's 60 years old. He has won everywhere, but that's a different, unique style of environment. Everybody else comes from this kind of positive culture building type of a place. And I think that that's the impact of a Dan Campbell in Detroit and the success that he is having. I think that that is the impact of a DeMeco Ryans in Houston as well. Guys who know how to set a program where guys want to come to work every day. And that's not to say that the way Bill Belichick has done things forever is wrong. The way that Mike Vrabel has done things forever is wrong. It's not to say Vic Fangio, who was essentially pushed out in Miami, he's had success at various points through the course of his career. And when you dig around on why Vic Fangio is not the defensive coordinator in Miami, it's not that his scheme had become stale. It's that he didn't have relationships with players like a lot of coaches do now. So that's one of the running themes, I think, is that this generation of players, does the Bill Belichick style, the Mike Vrabel style, the Vic Fangio style necessarily work? Again, Vrabel won a lot of games for a long time, lost 18 of his last 24 in Tennessee. I just think that positive reinforcement versus negative reinforcement culture, when team presidents and owners are looking at this right now, people like Amy Adams Strunk are talking about collaboration and alignment. You kind of end up with these guys who have operated as football gods and have had a great deal of control over their programs. Maybe that's just not the way that certain organizations want to set up their programs right now.
Well, I mean, that was a lot right there for sure. And the only thing I will say, and before we move on to the next subject matter, is whoever texted you that Harbaugh is a robot from a different planet sent to Earth to coach football must have skipped his tenure in Ann Arbor, where he related to 18 to 22-year-olds in a manner that potentially the new defensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles did not. And I would proffer to say, that's a pretty tight locker room he might build in Los Angeles. Just my 2 cents. Obviously, I'm a bit biased here, Tom.
But he's a different guy.
I know that. But
and it's worked.
And he's coming to shake up. And he's coming to shake up the NFL too, sir. I mean, like he's coming.
It's the biggest story. Think about this, Rich. It's not just the Chargers moved to LA 7 years ago as the tenant to the Rams at SoFi Stadium. And that was because, as I'm sure you remember well, the Chargers and the Raiders had their plan to go build a stadium in Carson, California. They lost out to the Jerry Jones cabal that wanted to build this mecca multi-billion-dollar stadium site in LA. The Chargers then had the first option. All right, you either go to LA as the tenant or you go back to San Diego with nothing and we let the Raiders move there. Dean Spanos and company chose, all right, we're going to go to LA. They've spent 7 years fighting for attention in that market, which is a difficult market, I think, to outdraw, especially when the Rams have Sean McVay and he goes to multiple Super Bowls and wins one. Brandon Staley did a lot over 3 years to try to build a positive, a championship culture. They invested in resources and they built out a lot of different departments. But now they go from being the little brother to the Rams to they're not just the biggest story in the NFL. They're the biggest story right now, Rich, in sports, quite possibly. Jim Harbaugh going there. He's won from the University of San Diego to Stanford to the 49ers to Michigan. He does things his own way. You hear a lot of more is more with Jim Harbaugh. It is a grind. He asks a lot of people, and it works, and he wins. I am fascinated to see what this looks like in LA with the Chargers. No matter how different of a dude Jim Harbaugh is, and he is one of the most uniquely focused, uniquely wired individuals we've seen in the NFL, he's now going to be doing battle with Sean Payton and the Broncos, with Andy Reid and the Chiefs, and whatever in the world Antonio Pierce and the Raiders are going to build out in Las Vegas. That's one of the big unknowns in this whole thing. I just think it's going to be such a fun division with such good coaches as we move forward here. And the expectations that for the Chargers last year were just, okay, they got to take the next step. They got to win a playoff game. You can fairly say right now the expectations that are going to be placed upon Jim Harbaugh are, you went to the NFC Championship game your first 3 years in San Francisco, went to a Super Bowl. That's where the bar is now in LA, and we'll see how exactly that all plays out.
All right. I'm gonna ask you one last thing before I let you go. What's the scoop with Deebo? I mean, this is it, right? So let's roll. What do we have?
Deebo does not have structural damage in that shoulder. It's not a hairline fracture like last time. He was limited in practice on Thursday. The fact that he's even out there limited is probably a good sign. We also know how violent Deebo's play style is. They're not going to put him in harm's way. When Deebo wasn't out there, Rich, for however many games that was earlier this season, they were not the same offense. And you saw that, and they lost games, and they didn't function as well. He is their tone setter to go up against a Lions team that is going to want to set the tone like they always want to do from go in this game. If Deebo can physically be out there, if the team clears him, he's going to give it a shot. There may also be something to be said if he knows that he's not 100%, that maybe exercise caution, get him closer to being all the way back come Super Bowl time. That is one that I would not be surprised at all if they take this up really close to kickoff here. But they should have a pretty good idea. If not today, I fully would anticipate that they list him as questionable. Should have a pretty good idea, I would think, after tomorrow's walkthrough. How is he feeling? Because that's the biggest thing, as Kyle Shanahan keeps saying. He's not injured in the sense of he's got something structurally wrong, but he is in a lot of pain. And that pain, even if you're going to take something to help with it, that is potentially going to be a factor in the final decision. Any
other injuries we should be looking for, or news on injuries? Mark Andrews is off IR, so he's going to make it back. I guess I'm asking multiple questions at once. Let's start with that, and then you could tell me about the rest of the injuries, about what to expect out of Mark Andrews, snaps-wise and play-wise.
Well, Mark Andrews has been a full participant since the middle of last week in practice. So everything seems to be tracking for him to play a significant role in this game, which is crazy.
Yeah, I know.
He cracked his tibia and suffered an ankle ligament injury in week 11. And you remember John Harbaugh at the time basically saying, like, yeah, it's not looking good. We'll hold out hope that maybe he can get back. But as Andrews progressed through his rehab protocol, all of a sudden it was like, okay, if we get to the championship game, we think there's a pretty decent shot. I don't know that he's going to go out there and play 70 snaps, Rich, just because his wind, as much as anything, is going to be an issue. But when they need him in red zone and otherwise, I would anticipate you're going to see a lot of Mark Andrews. Beyond that, on the injury front, Dan Campbell said Frank Ragnow is going to be good to go. It's a Pro Bowl lineman. He is their tone setter on the offensive line, so that's going to be a big deal for the Lions in that game. Isaiah Pacheco missed some time this week. He's dealing with a toe injury, and I think it's a knee injury. Andy Reid, though, indicating he should be good to go. So a lot of tone setters, Rich, that we're talking about these guys. Pacheco's another one, pound for pound. Give me him as the strongest, toughest dude in the NFL. But sounds like a lot of these are tracking toward them being out there on Sunday. Deebo is clearly the number one question.
Okay. Thanks for the time, Tom. You're the man. Let's talk next week. We'll chat soon. Or game day morning. Rich. I'm sure you're part of the 6-hour extravaganza.
I am.
Okay.
I'll be there a few times.
The Pelissero Palooza going to be joining us 6 hours. Catch the Rich Eisen Show every single day on the Roku channel, 12 to 3 Eastern, for free.